Hello, welcome everyone to this event, Destination 2030, Making 1.5 a Reality. This event is convened by the UN Climate Champions in partnership with the COP26 presidency. I'm delighted to now welcome to the stage Vice President Al Gore.
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I have the job of opening this session, but you're going to hear from the climate champions and the UK presidency, and they will fill in any gaps that I leave in my remarks. But what I would like to cover, first of all, I would like to say thanks to all of you for being a part of this historic event. I would like to encourage you to do even more, because here we are nearing the halfway point of this historic conference, and much remains to be done. But I would also like to note that much has been achieved already. Some of it is in the form of pledges that must be kept, and part of our task, all of us, is to ensure that these pledges are, in fact, kept. I was heartened at the very opening of COP26 when Secretary General Guterres announced, among other things, that he is forming a new group within the United Nations to monitor and assess and regularly report on all of the net zero pledges made by non-state actors. Those who have made pledges should understand very clearly that their actions will matter a great deal, and that any mismatch between their pledges and their subsequent actions will be noted very carefully. And civil society throughout the world is prepared to hold all of us accountable for matching deeds to words. We will see a continued surge in momentum to solve the climate crisis. Part of that momentum will come from Mother Nature, because we are seeing, rather obviously, an increase in the frequency, intensity, and destructiveness of the climate-related extreme events. It reminds me of a famous quotation from a previous British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who had been attempting to warn the world about the rise of fascism in the 1930s. And he made a speech in which he said, "The era of procrastination, of half measures, of soothing and baffling expedients, of delays, is coming to its close. In its place, we are entering a period of consequences." We are now experiencing the consequences of the climate crisis in every part of our world. The scientists warned us that these consequences were coming. Too many did not pay careful enough attention to those warnings. But because their warnings were proven to be spot on and exactly correct, if actually a bit conservative, we must pay even more careful attention to the warnings that they are giving us now. The latest sixth assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was released in August, contains the most dire warnings that the scientific body of experts has ever given us. What we have experienced so far is nothing compared to what would take place if we do not meet the pledges that have already been made here in Glasgow. The science is unequivocal, to quote the IPCC, and people are now experiencing it for themselves. But there is optimism as well as danger, because within the IPCC assessment is some rather hopeful news alongside their warnings. If we actually do reach net zero, when we do, Earth's temperatures will stop going up with a lag time of as little as 3 to 5 years. It is as if we can throw a switch and save the future of our civilization. And when we reach net zero, half of all the human-caused CO2 in the troposphere will fall back out of the sky and be absorbed by the upper levels of the ocean and the trees and vegetation in as little as 25 to 30 years. And a long healing process can then begin. Most significantly, perhaps, we will then be able to say to the young people who are out in the streets of Glasgow and have been out in the streets of cities all over the world every Friday and other days besides, demanding that we legitimize their expectations for a future that is worthy of them. We can do so, but we must put the period of delay and distraction and expedience in the past, recognize that we have entered a period of consequences, and make it a period of solutions. Some of the pledges that we have heard here this week will take a tremendous amount of work and creativity in order to redeem them, but we must hold them to account. And I would also point out that we are entering an era of radical transparency. We are now seeing more and more satellites and ground, sea, and air-based sensors, internet data streams, crowdsourced information gathering, and Climate Trace, an organization that I have helped co-found, is now using artificial intelligence to fuse together all of these data streams to develop extremely accurate and precise algorithms that can affix responsibility for every significant greenhouse gas source of emissions on our planet. We have already published the first independent, comprehensive, and timely inventory, nation by nation, industry by industry, sector by sector. Partway through next year, we will upgrade that inventory as the machine learning algorithms continue to improve, and we will report regularly, not only on a monthly basis as now, but weekly and in many cases on a daily basis. We have access to a complete picture of the entire Earth's surface every day, and soon we will have a complete picture of every square centimeter of the Earth's surface every 6 hours. And we are imaging in the visible range of light, also in infrared and in multiple other wavelength spectrums. We're supplementing that with all of the other sources of data, and we are compiling a comprehensive list of those who are responsible for each of the entities that are emitting greenhouse gases, not to be the climate police, but to be the neighborhood watch, except the neighborhood is the globe, and we are all in this together. And when we have actionable information, actionable information, I promise you, the demand for change will grow and grow and grow. We must keep at the center of our concerns the poor, the low-income communities, the communities of color and marginalized communities that have suffered the most from the climate crisis already. We should understand the connectedness of our entire world, not as a figure of speech, not as a metaphor, but as a reality. The pandemic has raised many of the same exact questions that have been raised by the climate crisis. Number one, should we listen to the dire warnings from the leading scientific experts, whether about an oncoming pandemic or a worsening climate crisis? Check. We should listen to them. Number two, can our interconnected global civilization suddenly be turned upside down in short order? Check. We've seen it with the pandemic, and the scientists are telling us it will be far worse unless we take control of the causes of this worsening climate crisis. The Lancet Commission has now told us that we could, if we do not act, expect to see 1 billion climate refugees migrating across borders. My faith tradition teaches me to welcome the refugee, to welcome the stranger. But my previous lifetime as a recovering politician in the world of government and politics has taught me that a large surge of immigration or migration in a short period of time can, because of the darker recesses of human nature, trigger xenophobia and anger and even violence and exclusion and soft violence and slow violence. We cannot allow this wave of authoritarian populism to spread around our world. But we must also take account of the hyper inequality in our world, and we should seize the ongoing effort to solve the climate crisis as an opportunity to redress this inequality. I had a good friend who was president of Bolivia decades ago, a very brilliant and good man. And he said, Al, inequality is a bit like inflation. You will always have at least a little, and at least a little is not a bad thing. And in the markets, we know that some inequality is always present. But he said, like inflation, you must at all costs avoid the hyper variety, because hyper inequality of the kind we now have in our world is a threat to both democracy and to market economics. Capitalism has tremendous strengths, allocating resources, balancing supply and demand, often unlocking a higher fraction of the human potential. And the alternatives to capitalism we experienced in the 20th century were catastrophic, most of all for the environments in which these alternatives were tried. But the current version of capitalism we have is in dire need of reform, because we are overly focused on one narrow slice of the value spectrum, the interests of short-term incentives in the hands of shareholders. What about the air? What about the value of the mountains and the ocean and the web of living species that we are now putting at risk? What about the plight of the poor? We have an opportunity as a global community to take advantage of a new era in human history. We are in the early stages of a sustainability revolution that is driven in part by machine learning and artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things and stunning advances in biotechnology, which are giving executive teams the ability to deal with atoms and molecules and proteins with the same proficiency that the IT companies have demonstrated in dealing with bits of information. This sustainability revolution has the magnitude of the Industrial Revolution and the speed of the digital revolution. For example, many are not aware that last year, in calendar year 2020, if you look at all of the new electricity generation installed worldwide in every country, 90% of it is renewable energy, most all of that solar and wind. Why? Because we have seen such stunning advances. 1 year before the Paris Agreement in 2015, electricity from renewable sources was cheaper than electricity from new fossil sources in only 1% of the world. 5 years later, it was cheaper in 2/3 of the world, and 3 years from now, it will be cheaper in 100% of the world. Now we see every auto and truck manufacturer switching to electric vehicles. And soon, within 2 to 3 years, 2 for most model categories, 3 to 4 years for all model categories, Electric vehicles will be cheaper than their internal combustion engine counterparts. That's why every significant automobile and truck manufacturer in the world is rapidly shifting to emissions-free electric vehicles. We are seeing the emergence of green hydrogen. Why? Because in the past it was prohibitively expensive to buy all of the energy necessary to separate hydrogen from oxygen. And so it was made from fossil fuels, also at great expense. But now, with the surplus of renewable electricity, we can make it from water, pollution-free, and use it for the high-temperature use cases like metallurgy. We have the tools that we need to solve this crisis. We have heard pledges that will move us in a long direction toward these solutions. We must ensure that these pledges are kept. We must not declare victory here. We know that we have made progress, but we are far from the goals that we need to reach. The missing requisite is sufficient political will. But part of our job here is to tell one another the truth about how far we've come and about how far we have to go, and recognize that political will is itself a renewable resource. Thank you.